Hello, everyone. Yeah, it's coming through. Cool. So thanks for the introduction. I'm Duncan, talking on behalf of some other really wonderful people from BBC's Research and Development Department, as well as the sort of product teams running the show. Going to talk about some of the, at quite a high level, I guess, compared to some of the technical talks we've had on some of the approaches and challenges that we're experiencing doing personalised recs for the BBC iPlayer. So hopefully I don't have to sort of justify what the BBC is to most people. I'd imagine most people have heard of it. But it's essentially the oldest national public service broadcaster in the world. We just celebrated our 100-year anniversary, going from the birth of radio through the birth of TV and then the birth of online. And we have this really important public service mission that kind of belies everything we do, basically to serve all the audiences within the UK, and summed up very pithily by Lord Reith in terms of inform, educate and entertain. That's what we try and do. We've got a suite of online offerings, one of which is the iPlayer, which I'll talk about later, but they include news, sport, sounds, which is our radio and podcast offerings, Bite Size, which is our children's educational content, and weather, because we are, of course, British. Now, about iPlayer, what is iPlayer? I realise that not everyone will have come across this. It's our UK-only live and on-demand TV offering, and we get sort of quite a large number of people within the UK using us each week. We've got quite a diversity of content that we're looking to recommend here. We've got 12 different live channels, including a number of different language-based channels. We've got Welsh channels, we've got Scottish Gaelic, and I think some Irish content as well. We've got a large back catalogue of this that we have sort of at our arsenal, and we have both children and adult offerings as well. So we cover quite a large number of use cases in a number of languages, despite being UK only. So, okay, maybe into more of the important, fun RecSys type information. First off, you've always got to state your objectives, what you're looking to achieve, right? And for us, we've got a number of sort of different ones. You can think of this as a bit of a multitask type thing. We are, of course, looking to promote sort of public service values. So the idea that we have content that is of national importance or, cultural significance within the UK that everyone should be aware of. We also have a lot of work to do in terms of editorial promotion, right? A lot of our systems form a human-in-the-loop, effectively, system, where our editorial colleagues will decide that certain content is worthy of promotion, and we have to work with that. On top of that, we have our standard engagement that is, again, an important output of what we're trying to do. And it's always useful defining what you're recommending. We're using titles and programs, so the idea of a show as a collection of different episodes. We recommend both titles, sort of full programs, so Killing Eve, say, or sort of individual programs within that, depending on use case. So we don't want to recommend the news to people. Sometimes you want to recommend individual news episodes based on particular topics. Okay, we work alongside linear TV, and that's kind of a huge part of what we do. And that means we've got a constant stream of live and new content coming in. It also means that we're really largely affected by external events going on in the UK. I'm sure it won't have escaped a lot of your notice that there was a coronation early this year. We have to kind of be able to adapt and recommend during these very large-scale event-driven conditions. I know that a lot of people, this is not a unique claim that we have a partial view of user preferences. I think everyone would think that. But we also don't even have a full view of our people's interactions with our services themselves, because a lot of people watch them on sort of live TV outside of sort of the iPlayer ecosystem. So we only have a partial view of people's watches of iPlayer content, which is obviously a challenge coming from this linear world. Within this, we also see very strong behavioural patterns with our content. So just a very highlight graph. This is the most technical it will be, unfortunately. We have very context-dependent, the lifetimes of our content that we have to recommend is really contextual. It's really genre-dependent, as I'm sure people will be aware. News and sport content. News is sort of out of date within a day or two. Sport, similar. But then drama or children's content has a much longer lifetime, and we've got to really be able to deal well with this heterogeneity of different content shelf lives. It's also really periodic. It's driven very strongly by linear schedules. So if something's on TV, people then, if they miss it, go immediately back up to catch up on it later that evening. I know I do that myself when I missed my favourite episode of MasterChef. So onto our initial approaches. So one thing we found when starting to analyse things offline is that obviously starting with simple heuristic baselines has been really, really valuable for us. It's not news that these, when tuned well, work really, really well and are quite hard to beat in many cases. And we spent a lot of time working with content-based filtering and collaborative-based filtering, similarity matrix methods. We indeed had a hand about 5-6 years ago in the development of RP3 beta, if people are familiar with that. And alongside those similarity-based metric models, we also use popularity quite strongly as well. We even have a paper here at this RecSys talking about how we might seek to use popularity to inform our cold start reps. And so in terms of our offline evaluation, it's not news, but I think it's worth highlighting that learnings and reviews from literature data sets don't really translate, and we found that the hard way, which means that constructing our own internal data sets and leaderboards is basically essential, and we have to spend a lot of time doing that and getting that right. And when we do that, as I've said already, these well-tuned baselines, if you've got the hyperparameters right, they are really hard to beat. Also, in terms of our evaluation, I mentioned what we were doing in terms of this sort of multitask thing. We're trying to we've got multiple objectives, and so evaluating within that context is also really important. Not only do we have sort of different carousels or rails within the page, each with their own kind of different blend of objectives. So you see this one highlighted in purple at the top is a very promotional space compared to continue watching, which is much more engagement. But we also have found the need to understand how these relate to one another in terms of the context of the entire page. How does the mixture of these different objectives and how well the different recommenders are fulfilling those objectives map together when you look at them all holistically. Also, our offline metrics depend really strongly on these external factors like the coronation, like Eurovision, like the World Cup. We need to have a recommender system that's appropriate for both event sort of led conditions and business as usual stuff. And that you can think of that as operational robustness. In order to get around that, we've spent a lot of time looking at sort of evaluating over long sort of time periods to make sure that we get a kind of good reflection of these event-driven conditions and sort of normal, well, I say more normal behavioural patterns. And one thing I found that it's been really interesting is that looking at your metrics over time in isolation is fine, but if you do that and plot what's going on in the UK at the same time, it's really, really powerful. You'll see spikes for popularity around public holidays and things like that, and that really has helped us understand what's going on in our systems. So in terms of sort of a bit more formulaic in terms of our research approaches, we've settled on, I think at least in the research and development department, some iterative improvement sort of framework. We don't have massive resources, we can't try out everything, so the idea is quickly work out what has enough value for it to be worth us looking at. Okay. And so to take an example of this, we might observe strong temporal behavior in our user interactions, right? And so we start out with these item similarity matrix baselines. We use those as a really nice way of prototyping what's going on. We start out with these bag of items similarity matrices, and then fold in historic interaction times, basically just using heuristic weights, right? 1 over the amount of time since the interaction happened as an initial step. But these allow us, if not going into production systems, but they allow us to quickly understand and demonstrate feature value, or whether there isn't, along these baselines before we start putting the extra effort in to build up to production systems. We found that to be very helpful in our efficiency as a team. It also allows us to build a sort of flexible set of parts to understand the dynamics of the system in which we're working. Okay, on to some of the current challenges that we're looking at. This is an abridged list. The list could go on and on. I'm sure a lot of people feel like that. But just to highlight a couple of interesting ones, I think, for me, how do we better reflect the needs of our editorial colleagues and ensure the desired behaviours of our product in terms of these public service values alongside engagement? I'm going to talk a little bit about ensuring true A/B testing in terms of a human-in-the-loop system, and how we ensure consistency within teams across the BBC. So first up, we find that we have a feedback loop with our editorial colleagues because of this human-in-the-loop nature of what we do. A lot of what we have is a case of we are given a bunch of content by our editorial colleagues, and we are asked to re-rank that and personalise that to curate it on a personal level. And the input that they have is basically inclusion or exclusion of items from this list that we get given. What we find is that that's a very, very crude way of allowing us to change how we behave in the recommendations. And so we're putting a lot of effort into how to encode the intent of what they want in a nuanced, quantitative way. So they might want everything, a whole list of content to be promoted, but some more than others. How do we understand that? We've also found through this that true A/B testing is tricky because the content we're given to recommend depends on what they're seeing in their dashboards, what the impressions are, what the click-through rates are, and what the national conversation is, And we aren't able to ask them to create a separate list in their heads for different variants. But what this does mean is that there is information bleed between our variants and our A/B tests online. And we're not in the business of A/B testing our editorial colleagues. That's not what we're here to do. But it's how to understand this kind of confounding variable in our online tests. There's also, I think it's in some ways well understood, but not a solved problem, is the how to understand the desired behaviours in terms of the subjective qualities of our systems. So how well do we uphold diversity, impartiality and balancing? That's really crucial to us. That's super important. And how do we understand that at a statistical level when we're evaluating offline and also online? We've got a number of different content categories. We want to make sure all stakeholders, including the users, are treated fairly. Currently, the way we uphold these is we do a lot of evaluation panel testing with editorial stakeholders to make sure that they pass the sort of sniff test. But they form only guardrails, and we can't optimise towards them. We can't sort of look at them at a greater level than you can panel test. And so it would be really, there's work going on to how do we quantify this and how do we understand this sort of at a greater scale, I guess. And finally, there's also just the sort of organisational challenge of reproducibility. We've got multiple teams doing this. We're a large organisation. How do we translate learnings across our RecSys products? We've got iPlayer, Sounds and News. They all have recommendations in them. They're all personalised. Can we identify what learnings we have that are product independent and transfer them whilst understanding what is domain specific? There are easy parts of this, right? Making sure your metrics have the same definitions, making sure the implementations are the same, making sure you've agreed on that. But there are always going to be differences, like what is an interaction? For BBC News, that's going to be an article view. For iPlayer, that might be a watch, or Sounds, it'll be a podcast listen. There are differences in that, and you can't always draw the same conclusion. But ensuring as much consistency in our evaluation between the teams requires effort, but it's really, really essential. Okay, so to conclude, I'm just going to summarise very briefly what I've mentioned so far. Our public service remit really strongly influences our recommendations. That goes through our success metrics, our editorial engagement, the human-in-the-loop kind of stuff, and also the national events that we have to deal with sort of in real time as they're happening. We've developed some research approaches that I'm sure will be improved in future around standard baselines and the way that we use offline evaluation, particularly in terms of long time periods for hypothesis testing and prototyping on these simple baseline models. And we're working on current challenges, including how we A/B test these human-based systems and how we quantify some of the more subjective qualities of what we do. And with that, I'm going to finish if there are any questions.
Let's thank our speaker. I had a question to get started. You referenced saying that you tried a bunch of approaches from the literature and things didn't seem to pan out. Are there any of those in particular you can share that you were kind of surprised of, like, hey, this should have been really good, but for some reason it didn't work for us?
I think we found getting anything neural to work has been really, really tricky. I think that's kind of quite a common experience, my understanding. We found that just item KNN has just performed so well that it's actually quite hard to beat in many situations. I think that's kind of my overriding conclusion.
Awesome. Online question from Nava. From your experience, how can we as computer scientists work best with editorial colleagues? What can we learn that we are not appreciating or asking for?
Yeah, it's a hard question because it's that kind of human interaction one. I've just learned a lot from being in the room and talking to them regularly, asking them what they're wanting out of our system and including them in effectively they are a step in our offline evaluation. And we've found that that's highlighted a lot of things that we might not have considered around the content and what we're recommending, the kind of balance of distribution of genres and things like that they're looking to get out. But yeah, I think first step is just talking to our editorial colleagues and developing a conversation where they feel they can be honest with you as well as a computer scientist. They're the ones defining what we're trying to do at some level, and we have to understand that and work with that.
Actually, just curious, kind of putting that together with the question I was asking. Yeah. When you're saying that things don't work better than baseline, does that include through this kind of like editorial offline step, or is it just on kind of pure offline metrics that like you typically look at?
That has principally been on pure offline metrics, which obviously they have their flaws. We use that as a filter before taking it to editorial because they have limited time, they have other things to be doing than sort of listening to us as well. So we have to be respectful of that.
All right, we got one more online question from Michael. How do you balance editorial taste versus actual user behavior from data for recommendations?
Yeah, that's really tricky, right? And a lot of that is we have to rely again on our editorial colleagues to kind of let us know when their wishes aren't being reflected well enough in the recs. Looking at the impressions that they get for the content that they're kind of feel is of national significance, national importance. It would be really nice to have a number, to say it's 0.3% engagement or whatever it is, but we have to be a bit more pragmatic than that, unfortunately. Fortunately, we get to talk to people who know the content better than anyone else. So.
Awesome. Well, if there are no other questions at this point, let's thank our speaker again.